Thank you. Okay, great. Okay, so my presentation is really talking about mapping principles and the development process involved. So the first question is to map or not to map? That is the question. So what is mapping? Mapping is a process of defining a relationship between concepts in one coding system, so your source codes, to concepts in another coding system, and that's your target. So a coding system can be a list of terms, a code set, they can be vocabularies, they can be terminologies, they could be just local or they could be proprietary. So they could be any of these things. Mappings aggregated into a table forms a map between the two systems, and a concept map is a file resource for a map. So why do we map? There can be many different reasons why we would choose to map. For example, for interoperability and data integration. So that might be to migrate a code system to another code system for implementation in an EHR or EMR. We might want to use it to form the starting point for a value set in a new system by using old legacy information to tell us what we want in our new system, to enable vendors to commence adoption of a new terminology. For integration, so if we've got different code sets and we want to combine it into a single common code set to allow for comparisons or data analysis, or maybe for categorizing, so grouping codes into defined categories for purposes such as reporting or funding. But why might we not want to map? It's really important to map only if you need to. This is because, one, of maintenance burden. So maps themselves can be quite expensive to build, and they do also require a commitment of time and resources to maintain. The more dynamic your code system, whether it's your source or your target, the greater the maintenance burden. If the intention is for continuing use of a map, then maintenance will be required ongoing, or at least until the map is deprecated. Another thing to note is the clinical risk. So using maps carry clinical risk due to the potential change or loss of meaning. And this is due to differences in meaning of codes in the code systems, as well as the context and rules the map was developed using. So to decide if it's feasible or cost effective to map your data, you really need to understand your data. Poor data itself is difficult to map and may actually give you a poor map quality. And poor data sometimes is actually impossible to map at all. So some of the questions that you should think about when you're looking at your data is, where does your data come from? What was it used for originally? What do you want to use it for now? Is the data actually reusable and can it be repurposed? Is the data linked in some way, and is it important to preserve those links? When was your data collected? Is it current? Is it historical? Are there different versions involved? What is the size of the data? What is your coverage? Is it quite homogeneous, or is there a lot of heterogeneity? And what are the limits or obstacles to actually getting the data? Is there privacy, ethics, and other proprietary licensing issues? So if you've weighed all these things up and decided, yes, I want to map, the first thing you need to do before you actually start mapping is actually identify your use case and your map purpose. So the method for creating a map and the associated rules and processes are actually tightly bound to the map's purpose, use case, and requirements. So you really need to know why you are doing this. When defining your scope and requirements, you need to ask, what is the main purpose of the map? Who is the intended audience? What is the scope of your content, so the source and the target? Who is responsible for developing and maintaining the map? And how will the map actually be implemented? A map itself must have a defined and specific purpose. This provides context to the map and influences decisions and rules made when mapping, and how to map when there's discrepancies between the source and target code system. An example of a purpose might be, the purpose of this map is to allow for emergency department SNOMED principal diagnosis codes to be mapped to the emergency department national minimum data set for funding. So you'll note here that the use case or purpose is really specific and explains which way the map is to be used and what the map is mapping. When you are reusing maps or repurposing maps, even though your source and target code systems may appear to be the same, if the use cases are different, you may end up getting unexpected or unwanted results. For example, if you take a map that is meant for coding for a clinical purpose, if you try and apply it for financial or funding purpose, you may not get the results you want. And even two different funding maps will give you different results often. So I have a few example use cases and some considerations that you might need to think about with each of these and see how they affect how your mapping processes would be. So for example, retrospective maps for backward compatibility. So that might be migrating a legacy code system to a national standard code system. And you'd be doing this for historical data to define code systems for use based on that existing legacy code system. So for this use case, you need to think about what data will you need to map. In this case, probably only the codes or the terms that exist within your data collection. And as it's for migration, you're probably only going to use it once, so you probably don't need to maintain it. However, on the other hand, if you're still interoperability, but you're doing perhaps a prospective map for continuing use, so if you're transforming codes from a local code system in your clinical information system and transforming it to a national standard code system. So in this case, you need to actually map all valid codes from your source code system, as you cannot predict what is required by users from the legacy data alone. And for maintenance, because you are planning to use it for continuing use, means you need to continuous maintenance is required. Another example use case is the integration use case. So you can use maps to allow the comparison of different code sets by converting codes to a single code set. So an example of this might be you would have different data sets from different implementations of the same system, but each of these have different terminologies implemented. So you need to think about which code system, which code you want to pick as your target code system. How different in content and semantics are those code systems, and can you actually get a sensible map? And what rules and conventions need to be applied to get a best match? So what compromises do you actually need to make in terms of granularity and specificity? The last use case that I've got is categorizing. So maps for assigning codes to higher level groups, perhaps for reporting, for funding, for cohort identification, research and analytics, perhaps for safety efficacy audits, or workflow or clinical decision support, linked in a patient journey. So some of the considerations of these maps might be the rules of the map. So is mutual exclusivity required? So can one source code map to more than one target code, or are you double dipping in terms of funding? And does every source code require at least one map? Is it okay if things don't get mapped and perhaps not get funded? And then for maintenance, you need to consider how dynamic these code systems are to actually understand your maintenance burden and costs. So once you've defined your use case and purpose, you can then move on to the mapping process and your rules that are involved. So before building this map, it's really important to define these processes and rules to have consistency between all personnel involved. The process and mapping rules should be documented clearly, and this includes the mapping process, the scope of the map, your map rules, and any risk assessments that you might complete. This is an example of a mapping process, so it's just the workflow, and it includes where you would put the risk assessment, your data processing, the actual build of the map, validation that you've done, quality review processes that you might add, and a reminder to update all your documentation at the end. In terms of personnel, mapping is definitely a multidisciplinary group. And you do require expertise in the source and target code systems. You also need expertise in the clinical workflow and setting of the source system and target implementation system. So these expertise doesn't have to sit within one person. They could be groups of people, but you generally need these types of skills. This is because your developing a map, you're actually doing the mapping, you're verifying content, probably testing and documenting, and maybe even releasing and providing implementation advice with the map. When considering the scope of your map, you need to think about what was the scope of the source code system? Was that, and how did that code system sit within the information model? You need to think about what the scope of the target code system is and how will it be implemented? What will the target information model be? You then need to think about the differences between the two. Do these scopes actually match, and should they match? There might be need to do some exclusions or create some specific rules about how the scopes will be translated. And is there any need for contextual information from the information model to be included in the decision of what the map target might be? Think about how much are you actually mapping, and if it's historical, perhaps just the data that's being used, but do you also need to map historical or inactive terms if you're using different versions of terminology? And you may also need to think about excluding some terms if they're ambiguous or duplicates or not within your desired scope. So for rules of the map, generally there's 3 different types: map patterns, mapping types or equivalents, and map directions. So all of these rules need to be revisited regularly, and because as the mapping process begins, there may be some rules that need to be added or existing rules need to be updated or adjusted, and you should keep your documentation up to date with all of these rules. Map patterns refer to, I guess, how many of the source term are mapped to how many of the target terms. So we've got 1-to-1, 1-to-many, many-to-one, and 1-to-none. So prior to mapping, you may not know what these patterns might be, but you do need to think about what might be allowed. So for example, in the funding case scenario, we would generally expect many-to-one or 1-to-1 pattern, but we wouldn't expect 1-to-many. So that is one source code mapped to many target codes. And that's because we would generally expect things to be funded once. So we would need to make sure that we didn't include that type of map pattern in our funding map scenario. For mapping types or equivalents, this describes the type of a relationship or the degree of equivalence of a source to the target code. So each map line would have one of these mapping type assigned to it. This is the example from the fire equivalence codes, and they've got quite a few. Generally, we would probably recommend just using perhaps these 4. So equivalent, so where we're saying that they're the same, whether it's wider, so the source goes narrow to a wider target, narrower, which is the opposite, or whether it's unmatched, that you cannot find a match for in the target. What you would pick is really dependent on your use case. So it depends on your purpose of your map, would determine what type of mapping type you're looking for. So for example, if you're doing a categorization type map, mapping some specific SNOMED clinical codes to ICD-10 classification codes for funding, you might be happy with wider mapping types. If you're migrating a legacy code system in a clinical information system to a different clinical terminology, you would prefer equivalence, but you might accept narrow and wider as well. Perhaps if you're translating a medication order, you might want to check that against a trade product pack, so like a branded medication. So in this case, you're probably going to go narrower. So just some examples here. If your original term, so I am categorizing SNOMED clinical terminology to a classification, I would start with a very specific code like pain in lumbar spine or chronic low back pain, and then I might go a wider map to a ICD code low back pain. Because I am moving to a classification, I'm happy with a wider relationship, and that's fine. If I'm migrating legacy codes, I might look for equivalents where I can. So for renal calculi and hand pain, I can find equivalents. For something like anxiety and DEPN, I might split that into 2 separate codes: anxiety disorder and depressive disorder. And in this case, they're narrower because they're more specific. And then in terms of going narrow again, amoxicillin 500 milligrams, I want to see what brands of amoxicillin I have in stock. And I might see that I have a amoxil 500 milligram capsule and an alpha mox 250 milligram capsule. So I can map it that way perhaps. And lastly, risk assessment. So whenever one code system is transformed into another, there is a level of risk being introduced, and that can have clinical impacts if the intent of the map is clinical. So we all agree that clinicians should be able to record what they need at the point of care, but we just need to make sure that there's no hidden background maps that are reinterpreting what they may have said. So we need to think about the influence on downstream or shared data and reports and results. When doing a risk assessment, we should be identifying all the patient risks, if there are any, and then perform and document these risk assessments, implement any risk mitigation measures, and obviously document all of these things. So it is particularly important for where a map is being used for a clinical purpose, that a clinical risk management approach or plan for patient safety risks is clearly defined. So once you've identified your use case and your map purpose, and you defined your mapping process and rules, we can prepare our data. So there's a lot that goes into preparing for mapping, and this is like the one step before that. So we've found in our experience, data in the real world is very rarely clean and tidy. Questions you need to have when you look at your data is, does your data actually have structure? And how is it represented? Is it in indents? And is there white spaces, whether they're leading or trailing? Is there truncated text that you need to take into account? Different data types, headers, footers, non-text characters like question marks or hashtags, as well as misspellings. Even when you have coded data, you might find data taken out of context. So you may have repurposed fields, data used as proxy. So it's the best, easiest, closest thing that a clinician could find because their clinical information system didn't support their needs. And we've also found that underlying coding has often become organic and uncontrolled, and there may be duplication of content, erroneous synonymy, conjugated terms, as well as ambiguity. So all of these things need to be taken into account. When you look at the data quality, is all your codes uniquely identified? Are there any duplicates or null values? Are there synonyms and preferred terms identified as distinct? And that really depends on what kind of terminology you're looking at. And is there any meaningful metadata that might make your job a bit easier? It's really important to make these decisions in the context of where the data was collected. So perhaps a hashtag, in some contexts, it might mean fracture, or it might mean number. A / might mean and or, question mark might be possible, probable, suspected. All of these things need to be worked out. So it's important to consult those who collected the data in the first place, liaise with them, make a decision about what these things mean in these contexts, document these things, and then process before you actually start mapping. So there's quite a bit of work that happens before the actual mapping part. Once you've pre-processed, you're able to finally start to build the map. So building the map, you may find some tools that are available that might be useful to you. Some of these may provide an automated mapping tool or function, and these are often useful after pre-processing. With these things, you often do need to apply appropriate filters so that you can get the best results, and they can increase your accuracy of the tool. With all automated mapping tools, though, we do recommend that the results of these be checked by a mapper in the team, as they're not going to be 100%. And then there's the manual mapping component, which is essentially just a user creating and inserting relevant target codes for each source code. For all of these, documentation is important, and it's important to update your rules as you go for consistency, and also note any issues encountered. After mapping, there's a validation and quality review component. There's different strategies that you can use. There's dual independent mapping. So this is actually where each code is independently mapped by 2 or more mappers, and then those results are compared and reconciled. Another alternate approach might be one user doing a map and then another user doing a full review. A third approach might be each code being mapped and then a sample of the mapping is reviewed by a reviewer, so perhaps 25% or 50%. You would pick which map strategy you pick is really dependent on your use case and the level of risk involved. Obviously, if it's a clinically used a map, then you have a higher level of risk, and so you then need to pick something with more review. It also depends on what personnel or team available. You may not have enough people to do these things, and that's fine. You kind of need to make the best with what you've got, as well as time constraints. So dual independent mapping and doing full reviews does take a long time, but if the risk is high, then it's recommended. With all of these, a conflict resolution or adjudication process needs to be developed to resolve any issues identified during the validation process. These may require clinical input, and all decisions should be documented. Some of these issues may not just be clinical, they may be terminological, so what the mapping type is and understanding some of the semantics of the underlying terminology. Once mapping is complete, a quality review should be undertaken so that you can consider the consistency of the application of rules and advice, to understand the validation process and to check the completeness of documentation. It's also great to have a look back to learn any lessons, as well as request any content if possible. So terminologies like SNOMED CT, LOINC, and HPO, they take requests for new content. So if during a mapping process, you've noticed some gaps in the content, they're always happy to take requests so that they can help to fill those gaps. With documentation, it's really important to map, to have documentation of your methodology and the decisions made. This is to allow reproduction of the mapping process, so when you're doing updates, but also as evidence of your mapping process that's been undertaken and your rules applied for compliance assessment. It's important to remember that a map is not necessarily static. Future versions of a map may require a change of decisions or rules, and these need to be clearly defined and applied consistently. Clear documentation allows the correct usage of the map, and also for users to identify when the meaning of the results of the map have changed due to changes in rules or processes. Often the person using the map is different to the one building the map, and while there is no guarantee that your map will be used as intended, having good documentation will definitely help and allow implementers to have a clear idea of what the map is, what it's for, and who it's for. So all of these things are really important. It's really important not to forget about maintenance. And I know it's really easy to think, oh, I've built this map and I'm done, but maintenance always comes back after a while. With maintenance, it's really important to consider changes to user and system requirements, whether they're additions or removals, changes to source code systems of the concept map, whether they're new, retired, update, or updated content. And a lot of that can be done by automated testing. Changes to your target code system. And when you do that, you do need to look at any non-equivalent maps as they may require review because there may now be better matches. Some use cases do require maintenance of retired content and keeping it in there and just adding new content. And some actually you would remove them completely. So it really depends on your use case. In terms of terminology maintenance, different terminologies do have different maintenance mechanisms. So some terminologies will give you version control or full history tracking. It might give you a deprecated status or a retired status. Terminologies like SNOMED, they have a historical association. So where a concept or a term has been retired, it might have a pointer to a new replacement concept, and that can help you with your maintenance of your map. In terms of map building tools. There's not too many out there. Many people just use Excel. However, we do have a tool available, and I can give you a quick rundown of that one. So this here, let me just share my screen. Sorry, 1 second. Okay, so what I have here is our Snapper tool. So Snapper is a free web browser application for creating maps. And we can share the address. What it does is it allows us to upload CSV or TSV files and create a map to SNOMED. So this does allow you to map all sorts of different classifications and terminologies. However, it is optimized to use it with SNOMED. So with this one, I can create a new map, and I can give it a name, example, and I can create, I can give it a target. So I am doing clinical findings or diagnoses. So I will give it a scope of a clinical finding, and I will set that up. Once I have this set up, I'm able to import my codes. So I've got some examples here. I might use this one here. I know it's a CSV. I have some source codes, and I have some source labels here. And I have the header, and then I can import these into my browser. So you can see here, there's a mix of things. There's hypertension, there's a few abbreviations, there might be some spelling mistakes, and there's a few different things. So what I can do is run the auto map, like I mentioned. So I will do that here. And go. So what this is doing is running an auto map process using and trying to match as many of these things to a SNOMED clinical finding. And you can see here, I've got 21 items, and it's managed to find some kind of match for 20 out of the 21, and there's one that's unmapped. We can see here hypertension has mapped to hypertension, obese, high blood pressure has mapped to hypertension. So you can see SNOMED does contain other terms that are related that are the same, so synonyms, and hypertension and high blood pressure are synonymous. So it's found a good match here. Same with GORD. It's found N and V for nausea and vomiting. It hasn't figured out what this is, hypercholesterol, whether that's a spelling mistake. It's hard to know whether it means hypercholesterolemia or hypo, but if I know that perhaps it's hypocholesterolemia, I can manually map this. So I can type hypocholesterolemia. I can type, this thing has a type ahead search, so I'm able to find it quite quickly. I can drag and drop and put it into my map. Flu, the influenza. I see here fracture femur. It's found something that's more specific than what I want. I'm trying to map an equivalent because perhaps I'm mapping legacy codes. So I can double click and it gives me some of the other options that it's found. So fracture femur here. So I might select that one. And then I would probably keep going until I finish. So it's found some of the acronyms, the shorthands, and so I'm happy with all of these. I can see where they came from, but I can change that. Okay, it's auto mapped, but I've reviewed it now, so it's final. And I know that these are equivalent maps. So this tool here kind of allows us to do a mapping quite simply, but it still requires human intervention. This map doesn't really this tool doesn't really do the workflow component. You can then, once you're completed, download the file as a tab separated file or a JSON file, and then review it outside of the tool. In terms of free text, it doesn't do a great job. Automated mapping is of some value, and that's why we do recommend pre-processing beforehand. And it doesn't really have any AI or NLP involved, so that's something to keep in mind. There are other couple of products available. So, example, I think TermWorks from Apollon, they do have a spreadsheet add-on, which might be useful. And then there is a Odyssey product called Usagi, which I haven't had a chance to look at yet. Just some take-home messages. A considered approach when mapping is required. If you don't need to map, don't do it. But if you need to map, then, you know, go ahead. But please don't underestimate your maintenance burden and the clinical risks involved. At the end of the day, use case is king. It determines so much. So it determines your development approach, your rules and tolerance for error, as well as the reusability of the map. And it's really important to document everything so that people know what you did, why you did it, and who is that for. And that's the end. So if there's any questions, happy to take, and happy to show other things if we've got anything.
Thank you so much, Ms. Kailin. I hope you all enjoyed this amazing presentation. Now, Ms. Kailin will answer some questions that were sent in the chat box, or you can open your mic to ask the questions.
I go for him. Go for him.
Hello, Dr. Alvin.
Yeah, Aileen, thank you very much. If the source target is, if the target is bigger than the source, would you still recommend source to target mapping or target to source mapping? Over.
Sorry, what was the beginning of your question? Sorry.
If the source and target are not similar in numbers, for example, if the target data set is larger than the source, do you still do source to target mapping or do you do target to source mapping?
I think it really depends on your use case and why you are doing it. So what you're implementing. So if you're going from, it really depends on your use case and why you're mapping and what the implementation will be. So it doesn't matter which one you designate as your source and target, but if your target is a lot bigger and it makes sense clinically to go the other way. So for example, if you're trying to map a classification like ICD to terminology like SNOMED, which gives you much more granular, very specific, like clinically usable stuff at the point of care, you might have a lot of trouble because of the rules that are involved within ICD. So ICD might say include this, exclude this, include this, exclude this. So it might actually be easier to map it from the clinical terminology to the big classification, like the wider classification. So I would recommend it that way, but it also depended on how you were going to use it and how important those rules were. Building a classification to a terminology is very difficult, and we would generally see it go the other way. Is that what you are referring to?
Yes. Thank you, Kailin. I think we need experts to do this. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a really difficult thing. And when you're mapping a classification and a terminology together, you need to understand both, because the terminology has its own rules and then the classification has very specific rules as well. And so you need expertise in sort of both as well as the mapping process. So it can get quite complicated, definitely.
I think the key questions in the ministries are: do you have expertise inside the ministry? And if you don't, it's good to outsource this while you are building internal capacity. Versus building internal capacity and going through all of the hitches and problems along the way as you learn from your mistakes over.
Yeah, definitely.
Hi, this is Punchai.
Hi, Dr. Punchai.
Yeah, thank you very much. My question is about the tool, the sniper. You show us that the target is nomad and the source is kind of the local. In that tools, do you what kind of the p-roading terminology that you have? Nomad, loin, or something? And if like in Thailand we have our medicine terminology, and if the hospital would like to do kind of the mapping and also use all the feature that you said, the wider the mapping type, can we load the target term into that, and how they know that TMT is the kind of the SNOMED extension.
Yeah.
We haven't formatted like the RF2.
Yeah.
I don't quite sure that if we want to kind of the keep the relationship similar to the SNOMED, how would we should do to load into the snapper over?
So Snapper speaks to our fire terminology server. So any terminology like TMT that can be put into a fire resource can then be used as a target for mapping. So I believe that sort of, is that process happening at the moment? I'm not sure, Kate.
No, it is still in our local authoring tools and export into the to the Excel file.
Right.
But the Excel file is kind of the different sheet. We don't incorporate the relationship like the small city, because we don't have the tool to authorize the TMT like the Snowmed City. We haven't do that. I at first I think that the Snapper also can be do the authoring tool too. Is that
Yeah. So Snapper can be used. So there's two components to Snapper. Hi everyone, I'm Kate Everell. I also work with Carmen and the team. Snapper has two components. There's Snapper Map, which is the mapping tool which Kylie showed, and there's Snapper Author. And I'm sure next week when Kyle's talking about value set and code system creation and maintenance, Kylie will show some of those other aspects of the tool. So Snapper talks to a fire terminology server, and it uses kind of Smart on Fire and all the rest to do that. So there are the two different processes, and I think one of the first things is looking at how do you take something like Thai medicine's terminology and turn that into a fire code system and put that into a terminology server as a fire code system. Because something like Ontoserver is a fire native terminology server, and then part of that process you can then point to a terminology server to do that mapping activity as well. But there's a few kind of different steps in the process. Where something like Snapper works is, yes, it supports out of the box already things like Loink and SNOMED, etc. And then there are other code systems and classifications to turn into fire code systems and then to load them into something like Ontoserver to support that activity. So I think we're really happy to work both with yourself and Dr. Alvin and your team, Dr. Bunchai, in Thailand as well, and do some examples around how you can take some of those existing local code sets, turn those into fire code systems and put them in the terminology server, or take something like a local code system and look at how you could map it to SNOMED within the tooling as well.
This remind me when I saw the mapping tools. Remind me the mapping capacity of the Realma.
Yeah.
I think Realma also have their target, which is the LOI already there, and it can input by the HL7 version 2 or Excel file or whatever. That's what we remembered. It seems like Snapper is similar to that, but it seems like you have more functionality than the Realma, right?
Yes, yeah. It's been a long time since I've played with the Realma tool. I think probably coming up to 19 years since I actually looked at LOIC mapping. That's taking me back. So there is I think with the Fire authoring tool, it's very, so the Snapper author, it's very kind of Fire focused. And then Snapper map, Kylie, you'll use that much more frequently, as well as the Snapper authoring tool. So there's quite a few more features in it to support that different functionality of different code systems to different code systems. But the whole thing around it is to be able to have point to a terminology server that has those different code systems available in it.
I wonder that how Snapper working with SnowMed. You said it Snapper talking with Fire server, right?
Yeah.
And the SnowMed CT they release like the RF2 or RF2, right? Something like that. And how you work with that format?
Yeah, no, Ontoserver supports SnowMed in the terminology server. So, and it supports LOIC. So there's actual special support in the way that SnowMed is treated as a Fire code system. And Fire actually calls out SnowMed specifically around how to manage that as a Fire code system within the Fire terminology server, similarly to LOIC. So Ontoserver supports all of that functionality of SnowMed and similarly to LOIC within the terminology server. So that's something that's called out specifically in the Fire specification. And then you can take other code systems and transform those into Fire code systems. So things like ICD 10, we actually manage also as a Fire code system within the terminology server. So there's different specifications or things that we're looking at. So this could be something similar that Thailand thinks about with the Thai medicines terminology is how you do that transform from the Thai medicines terminology to a Fire code system. And so where we've done things like that with other countries, we've open sourced that transform. So for example, we've are working with the NHS and for a number of those code systems and developing transforms and open sourcing how you can do that transform. So for our transforms or for CLAML for ICD. So there is definitely an approach to do that. And then you can have that one standard way to interact with any of the terminologies using those standard Fire APIs.
Oh, so it seems like out of scope what we are going to talk in these weeks and next week, right? It seems like DM&D is one of the terminology in the UK. And now you said you are working with them to transform their DM&D into kind of the Ontoserver. Yeah,
to turn it into a Fire code system, so then it can be supported by any Fire terminology server.
Ah.
Yeah, so the aim is that's one of the things and one of the key things around something like Ontoserver is it's completely Fire native and standards based. So what we do is then ensure that, for example, if we're working with DM&D and with the NHS team to say how do we put DM&D in as a Fire code system, then we could make that transform itself open source so that anyone could know how to do that. Or similarly, how, that's a choice of the owner of that code system. But the aim is that the way those code systems are supported in the terminology server is supported using that standard around what a Fire code system is or a Fire value set, so that there's nothing proprietary in the way that the terminology content or code systems are managed.
So coming to another question, that if we want to do the TMT to be the Fire compliant, do they have any tools to help doing that?
I think it's a bit like sitting down with the team and looking at how to do that transform, and then building that transform so you can do that transform from so it's just getting some devs, some smart developers or software engineers, and saying, let's build that transform from Thai medicine's terminology to a FHIR code system, so that then you can continue to use that transform as you update and maintain the Thai medicine's terminology. So I think one thing that we could do with you and your team is support you so that the team develops the transform, but support that process so that the capability and capacity is within your team, not within our team.
Okay, thank you. It helped a lot.
Yeah, support you through that process, because I think the important thing is we want to ensure that we can help your team build the capability around how to do this, and we don't hold all the knowledge.
Okay, thank you. Rat, you can ask. You can open your mic and ask directly. Over.
Thank you, and hello everyone. I'm Rat from Thailand. I just have a question. Just wonder, is it possible to map a post-coordinate concept like in SNOMED CT to some other thing, other code system? And if it's possible, is it a good thing to do or is not a good thing?
It is technically possible to do it. And you can do it, but it's why are you choosing to do it? And if you choose to do it, will someone else be able to read it? So you can do it and you can build your own meaning. So whether are you mapping to the post coordinated? So something to SNOMED with multiple components. So a procedure and then maybe laterality of left, that kind of thing. Yeah. So, I mean, you can do it. Technically there is a way to do it, but what you do with the information and how someone might be able to use that when you take it and implement it into your system, will they understand it? And so often why you're doing it is probably the question. And will someone else be able to use it? I think as well, the other thing that you need to take into account is why is there not the right SNOMED code? Sometimes that kind of thing, if it's a very commonly used thing, perhaps it should be something that SNOMED International actually puts into the normal SNOMED core content, and you should, so that everyone can use it. So those are kind of the answer. There's no one right answer. So technically, yes, we would probably recommend no if possible, because not many people can unpack it the same way that you created it. And is it a real gap in SNOMED, and should they do something about it?
I see. Yeah. Thank you.
Yes, I have another question about the snapping mapping tools. In your lecture, you said that we should do the documentation and maintain the documentation on the rules that we create of mapping. Does the snapper also have the documentation rule that related to the process of the mapping?
No,
I mean, inside that, do we have to use our word to write down something like that?
Yeah, unfortunately, it doesn't have a lot of the things that sit around the mapping. It only deals with the mapping itself. Within the tool, it does allow you to record the scope. So what your target, what you're mapping to and what you're mapping from, but that's all it allows. You can put a little bit of in the in the snapper map, which is what I showed you, it doesn't really allow you to add in any metadata. In SNOMAP Author, which I'll show you next week, which is how you can publish a FHIR concept map, so a map but in the FHIR specification, there are some extra bits you can include. So you can include some extra information, you can put copyright information, you can put all of the things that a FHIR concept map allows you to do, but it's not detailed. There's no detailed rules. That kind of thing needs to probably, well, at the moment would need to sit outside that, or your map rules or your processes, all of that kind of thing. Sorry, yeah, so.
Another question, this is more not technical, it's more on working with people like the user. people seem to be very think it's easy of mapping. They just say, oh, you just going map, and then many people always thinking the two-way the two-way mapping. They don't understand the target and the source and the target, and also the use case that you said is the king, right? We have to define the scope. How you deal with the people who said, oh, just map for me? How did you deal with that?
And you're 100% right. Like, we definitely have people who are just like, oh, you can just map, or someone else has already mapped, we can just take that map and do it. And often they just do it anyway. And then you look at the results and you can see why. So for us, it's really about education. I, created these slides a little while back to try and help people understand how important use case is, and try to explain why the use cases are different and what that means in terms of the mapping rules and the results of that map. We have it a lot locally where people are trying to use the results of the map that they were mapping for funding reasons, and they try to use it for a clinical identification of a cohort, and they wonder why they miss, hundreds of patients. And it takes 3 years worth of data for them to realize that the reason why it doesn't work is because the map wasn't made for that. And we really do struggle with that. And for us, it just comes down to education and trying to explain, usually after the fact, why the map's not working for them.
One thing that you mentioned, that it expert might be from the clinical expert and the terminology expert, maybe to work together.
Yeah.
And how did you get them, like the clinician who said, oh, why don't we, you just map our local code into the SNOMED? And how other than the education that you said, that do you have any suggestion or the approach that we can working with them, the one that
Yeah, I think partly it's also the strategy at the Ministry of Health or at the country level around what's your data strategy, what's your desire around, so looking at things like where you want to implement, and if you choose to implement national terminologies and classifications, being very clear around what the roles and the purposes are of those. And I think this is something that we've certainly learnt over the last number of years, and the NHS is doing the same, is being very clear around where you might want things like terminology and use, like SNOMED, at the point of care for clinicians, where you will use things, as Kylan said, for funding purposes, and whether they're classifications or whether they're also SNOMED or other terminologies. But having that very clear kind of role, understanding of what is the role and the purpose of the different data standards, and are you looking for interoperability? Are you looking for funding? Are you looking for research? And partly starting to kind of define and be clear around that and what that long-term vision, because then you can truly assess around, is the value of mapping, because I'm doing it to help migrate from something that's local and proprietary to a national standard? Do I need to map because I want a national standard to be used by the clinicians, but I also then need to map it to something else like a classification for research or reporting purposes? So I think one of the things is having that clear articulation around what is the value of the data, and what is the purpose of the data, and what is my focus, because I think then you can start to build those clinical champions in that way as well. And whether that's at a hospital level, because you need the clinical champions within the clinical networks, or whether that's champions that are around research, so that there is that really strong vision. I think it gets really hard, and it's certainly been challenging where we didn't have that really clear distinction of the value of why I want to record this information and how is this information actually going to be used. Because there are certain things that you can get away with from a clinical safety or clinical risk point of view if it's downstream reporting, versus I actually want to make sure that the term that is being used in the record that I as a clinician put in the record is clearly understood by the clinician that I'm exchanging this data with in much more real time to deliver care for an individual. And that really brings that risk into it and how much risk can come into it, because one could actually have quite adverse events for an individual versus my reporting for funding might not get, that's also important to a lot of people around dollars, but, it's much bigger imperative. And I think, the more that you understand what you're using that data for, the more risk you can live with in terms of maps. Or you may say, actually, this is something that I want to map and migrate and move to a national standard because I don't want to wear the risk at all if it's actually going to be someone's life or death if I get this map wrong.
Did you have the some kind of experience or heard about the experience of the Malaysian when they implement SNOMED with the cardiovascular expert? Did you have talked to them about those or have any experience? I found that they are suffering a lot when they all the experts would like to get their legacy, maybe diagnosis or
one of the things that works quite well is sometimes getting that legacy code set and sitting down and actually doing that, either sitting down with the clinician and going, okay, let's search for that term. And probably 99% of the time you find it in something like SNOMED, if that's your preferred choice, or sitting down with the clinician and mapping and showing that those terms are there. Or you might find that there's some gaps around synonyms, etc. So in Western Australia, so in one of our states back in 2012, they implemented SNOMED within their hospital discharge summary application. So they just put SNOMED straight in. They put a really good user interface type ahead search on top of it for the clinicians. They did not train clinicians in SNOMED. They didn't really talk about SNOMED in a big way. And they deployed this application. And what they did do before they did it is they took the existing local code system that they had all of the common acronyms and the favorites of the clinicians, and they made sure that was built in as search terms. But what the clinician had to select to put in the record was a SNOMED term. And in the first, they deployed it across 3 major teaching hospitals. And there was a little bit of angst from the clinicians, and the clinicians fed back and said, we can't find the terms that we need. And the person who built the application actually did a trawl and looked at all of the searches that the clinicians were doing and where they found or where they didn't get a SNOMED return and able to select it on their first search. And 98.5% of the time, out of all of the thousands and thousands of interactions, the clinicians got the term that they wanted on their first search. But that 1.5% of the time, half of that was missing content within SNOMED that the clinicians were really important to the clinicians. And half of that was around acronyms that weren't there or common misspellings. So they were able to really quickly update the search terms, but also importantly, they fed back to the National Release Centre and got those missing concepts that the clinicians really were passionate about added in, and kind of within that month that was turned around back to the clinicians and back in the application. So trust was immediately built with the leading clinicians that the content was there that they needed, and that at a national end you could be really responsive to the needs of the clinicians. And they created kind of a user group for the first kind of 12 months. And as I said, that's 2012. Now, it's full SNOMED going out for presenting problem and primary diagnosis, secondary diagnoses, etc. within their discharge summaries. So part of it is about being able to have that flexibility and that responsiveness to work with the clinicians and truly demonstrate that the content that they need is there, and quickly get in the content if it's not there that they do need to be able to build that trust and that relationship. And I think that was a really important experience within Western Australia. Within Queensland, they had champion clinicians who were very strong around what the data vision and data strategy was. So they were kind of working with the rest of the docs to say, the reason why we want to go down this structured terminology path and have something like SNOMED is that we want to be able to reuse this for research and provide real-time research, real-time analytics back to you and deliver services. And in order to do that, we need to start getting the data in the right format. So they picked 1 or 2 reports that they knew had meaning to the clinicians, so that, again, in a different way could say, now that we have this data, we can now present you back a report that's much more meaningful to you. So I think a couple of the experiences, like picking the things that make the most difference to the clinicians. One is the terms there they want, or to be able to demonstrate that the value of, now I've got structured data, I can actually give you a better experience around a report or decision support. So it's not the same for everyone, but definitely finding those champions, picking what will make the most difference, and being able to demonstrate that quickly seems to have worked across a number of our states.
I would not to be the monopolize this conversation. Any question from the audience? Kevin, any question? And Thanapop, Natanai, any question from your experience or something? Okay, it seems like we have 2 minutes over. Thank you very much, Karen and
Kate.
Thank you, Miss Kate.
Nash. Right? I don't see your name aside. Oh, okay. Thank you. I think it helped us a lot. And what I learned is that we have to manage the expectation of people who thinking about the mapping. It's just easy. It just snap, something like that. It's not. It seems like very complex, like you said.
It's the maintenance. One thing, if particularly because Carly's going to show you around value sets and Snapper Author next week, is if you have a smaller code system, a smaller local code system, so Dr. Bunchai or Dr. Alvin, if there are other smaller code systems, please send those through, because then we could actually use that code system next week. So Thai medicine terminology, really rich, is a much larger code system, and I think that needs to be done more as a transform. But if you've got a shorter code system, then we could give that as an example and use an example that has meaning to you. Otherwise, we'll just bring something along and Kylie will demonstrate it. But very happy if you have one of your own, please send that through, and we can use that as part of the demonstration next week and part of the presentation.
I think I already sent the TMT. Is that too big? Is that too big?
Yeah, we need to do a transform for that. That's too rich and complex. So we need to do a transform for that separately. But if there's a shorter local code system that's not the Thai medicine terminology, and whether that's yourself, Dr. Bunchai from Thailand, or whether Dr. Alvin, there's another code system from the Philippines. Yes. And
I'm sending the hepatitis one. It's very small.
Okay.
But we would like to learn that how we're gonna migrate the TMT, which is in the relational database, with all the relationship into the Ontoserver, which will create the file compatible.
Yes, and I think
that it can be used as the target of the mapping.
Absolutely, Dr. Bunchai. So I think Jim is drafting you an email to send through to say, shall we set up a separate session to work with who in your team, and as I said, to talk about the process to create it. So we'll help you guys create the transform, so that then you've got that capability and skill in-house. So we'll set that up. And I think, Dr. Alvin, we also had some questions around the hepatitis spreadsheet that we already have. So I think that will get through. So let's focus on both of those. But thank you everyone.
Because I asked this because of we gonna, if we can be put the TMT at the target, then it will variable all the regions that they can use it, similar to the DMND, something like that. I think that would be good, and then they will all will benefit from that.
Yeah,
There's a drug component in our hepatitis set for drugs for hepatitis. Maybe we can use TMT for that. That's something I'll be interested in.
Yeah, no, excellent. Well, we will be sending some more emails through with some additional questions, and we look forward to seeing you all next week as well and continuing the discussions. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Karen and
Thank
Kate.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.